Mr. Darcy makes his first visit to the Bennet family's home, Longbourn. His arrival causes mixed feelings among the Bennets. Mrs. Bennet is particularly eager to see him, hoping that he will fall in love with one of her daughters, preferably Jane. Mr. Darcy's social awkwardness and aloofness become more apparent as he interacts with the Bennet family. He does not engage much in conversation and often seems uncomfortable with the casual manners of the family. Elizabeth notices Mr. Darcy's unease around her family, which only strengthens her opinion of him. She believes that Darcy looks down on them because of their social position and lack of wealth. She does not feel sympathy for him and continues to think of him as arrogant and proud. However, despite his reserved nature, Mr. Darcy occasionally gives Elizabeth a look that hints at a growing interest in her. Although Elizabeth does not acknowledge it, there are early signs that Darcy's feelings are beginning to shift, though he is still conflicted by his pride and sense of superiority. Mr. Darcy, still uneasy in social situations, tries to make small talk with Elizabeth during his visit to Longbourn. Despite his awkwardness, he begins to take notice of her. Elizabeth, however, is not impressed by his attempts at politeness. She sees through his formality and considers his lack of warmth to be a sign of his arrogance. Darcy, although trying to be civil, cannot hide his discomfort, especially as Elizabeth is not charmed by his wealth or status. Elizabeth, in turn, has no intention of trying to win his favor. Instead, she focuses on her family's more pressing concerns, like her sister Jane's developing relationship with Mr. Bingley, whom Elizabeth is still unsure about. Elizabeth's dislike for Darcy grows stronger, while Darcy's feelings for Elizabeth begin to evolve, even though he is still struggling with his pride and initial judgment of her family. Elizabeth's dislike for Darcy only deepens after his awkward behavior at Longbourn. She becomes increasingly aware of his snobbery and inability to connect with people outside of his social class. Elizabeth's sharp wit and her ability to see through Darcy's veneer of civility make her skeptical of his intentions. As Darcy continues to avoid Elizabeth and keep his distance from her family, Elizabeth remains unimpressed. She begins to view him as cold and haughty, convinced that he is looking down on her and her family. Meanwhile, Darcy becomes more intrigued by Elizabeth's intelligence and independence, although he does not yet fully recognize his feelings for her. After Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins' proposal in the earlier chapters, he is still not deterred. He insists that Elizabeth is simply being modest, and that she will come to see the wisdom of marrying him. Mr. Collins is a man who is confident that he knows what is best for everyone, and his persistence is almost comical. He is not offended by her refusal but instead is convinced that she will eventually change her mind. Mrs. Bennet is furious with Elizabeth for turning down such a good match, especially since Mr. Collins is the only option for securing the future of the Bennet family estate. She tries to pressure Elizabeth to accept him, but Elizabeth stands firm in her decision. Mrs. Bennet is upset and accuses Elizabeth of being foolish, but Elizabeth's refusal remains unshaken. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins remains calm and insists that his proposal is not just about romantic attraction, but also about duty and convenience. He mentions that Lady Catherine de Bourgh, his benefactor, advised him to marry, and he is simply following her instructions. Elizabeth's refusal to marry him shocks him, but he continues to believe that she will eventually accept him. His views are based entirely on logic, social duty, and self-importance, which makes him an almost ridiculous character in the story. Jane continues to be kind and gracious to Mr. Bingley, and it seems clear that he has an interest in her. However, Jane is still unsure of Mr. Bingley's feelings and is too polite to ask him directly. Despite her uncertainty, it is clear that Mr. Bingley is very fond of Jane. Meanwhile, Elizabeth begins to notice a pattern in Mr. Bingley's behavior. He is often influenced by his sisters and Mr. Darcy, especially when it comes to matters of Jane's family and social status. Elizabeth suspects that Mr. Bingley's interest in Jane may not be as strong as she initially thought, and she becomes concerned that Jane may be losing her chance at a marriage proposal. While Jane remains hopeful and innocent about the nature of Mr. Bingley's affection, Elizabeth's cynicism grows. She begins to notice how Mr. Bingley's actions sometimes seem controlled by outside forces, such as the influence of his sisters, who are more interested in social propriety than in Jane's happiness. The story continues with the Bennet family interacting with the newly married Mr. Collins and Charlotte. Elizabeth visits them at their home, which is located near the Bennets' estate. Charlotte and Mr. Collins have settled into their life together, and Elizabeth observes how different their relationship is from what she imagined. Charlotte, as always, is pragmatic and realistic about her marriage. She has made the decision to marry Mr. Collins not because of love but for security and stability. While Elizabeth cannot understand Charlotte's choice, she begins to respect Charlotte's practical approach to life. Charlotte's decision shows that she has accepted the limitations of her social position. Whereas Elizabeth continues to hold out for a marriage based on love. During her visit, Elizabeth is once again struck by Mr. Collins' awkwardness and pompous nature. His long speeches about his connection to Lady Catherine de Bourgh and his obsession with social status make him seem ridiculous. Charlotte, however, seems content enough with her choice, showing that she values stability over passion. Charlotte represents those who marry for practical reasons, while Elizabeth, still holding on to her ideals, cannot imagine such a union without love. As the plot progresses, Mr. Darcy makes another visit to the Bennet family. This time, he seems somewhat more comfortable in their presence, but still distant. Elizabeth, however, does not trust him and remains as critical of him as ever. She sees his arrogance in every interaction and feels that he looks down on her family. During this visit, Mr. Darcy has a conversation with Elizabeth, and though the two exchange pleasantries, there is an underlying tension. Elizabeth is determined not to be charmed by his wealth and status, and Darcy seems almost frustrated by her resistance to his social standing. It is in these moments that we see the subtle shifts in their dynamic. Darcy is intrigued by Elizabeth's wit and intelligence, but he is also struggling with his pride. He is still convinced of his own superiority, but there are signs that he is starting to question his own assumptions, particularly about Elizabeth and her family. Jane Bennet falls ill again, and Elizabeth is once again the one to take care of her. This time, Jane is bedridden for a longer period, which gives her more time to reflect on her feelings toward Mr. Bingley. Despite her illness, Jane remains hopeful that Mr. Bingley will visit her and express his affection, but he does not. Elizabeth begins to worry that Jane's illness is keeping Mr. Bingley away, and she grows more suspicious about his true feelings for her sister. Elizabeth's suspicions grow as she realizes that Mr. Bingley's behavior seems controlled by his sisters and Mr. Darcy. She feels that Mr. Bingley is being influenced by outside forces and may not be acting on his own desires. This is a moment of realization for Elizabeth, who begins to see Mr. Bingley as too easily swayed by others, especially Darcy, who has been cold toward the Bennet family from the beginning. Elizabeth begins to reflect more on Mr. Darcy's character. She is still convinced that he is proud, arrogant, and dismissive of her and her family, but she also notices some contradictions in his behavior. On one hand, he is distant and cold, but on the other hand, he occasionally shows signs of being interested in her. During a conversation with her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth confides her feelings about Darcy, expressing her deep dislike for him. However, Mrs. Gardiner suggests that Elizabeth may be misjudging him. Mrs. Gardiner encourages Elizabeth to consider that Darcy's reserved nature might not be as offensive as it seems and that perhaps there is more to him than meets the eye. Elizabeth's feelings remain conflicted. She is unable to deny the growing tension between her and Darcy, but she refuses to believe that he could truly be a good person, given the way he treats her and her family. This inner conflict sets the stage for the changes in their relationship as the novel continues. Elizabeth becomes more aware of Mr. Darcy's character and begins to see him in a slightly different light, although her opinion of him is still largely negative. She reflects on the awkwardness of their previous interactions and notices that, despite his aloofness, there have been moments where Darcy seems to be interested in her. However, Elizabeth dismisses these thoughts, as she is still convinced that Darcy's pride and social superiority make him unworthy of her attention. Meanwhile, Darcy's behavior toward Elizabeth continues to be somewhat distant, but there are subtle signs of a shift in his feelings. He is still reserved and acts with the cold manners of someone who feels above the others around him. But there is a growing awareness in his eyes when it comes to Elizabeth. Despite his earlier judgment, he seems to have begun to value her intelligence and sharp wit. However, Elizabeth, firmly rooted in her prejudice against him, interprets his actions as further evidence of his condescending nature. Jane, still unaware of Mr. Bingley's true intentions, continues to believe that his affection for her is genuine. However, Elizabeth, who has been observing the situation more closely, becomes increasingly concerned that Mr. Bingley may be retreating from Jane because of the influence of his sisters, who do not like the Bennet family. She fears that Jane is losing her chance with him. Not because of anything she did, but because of external pressures. Elizabeth tries to advise Jane to be more open with her feelings, but Jane, always polite and reserved, believes that Mr. Bingley will act according to his own heart. Elizabeth's skepticism grows, and she wishes Jane could be more forthright about her emotions. Elizabeth's growing awareness of the way social pressures influence relationships is becoming more evident. Mr. Collins and Charlotte invite Elizabeth to visit them at their home, and Elizabeth reluctantly agrees. Upon her arrival, she is once again struck by the absurdity of Mr. Collins' self-importance and pompous behavior. He speaks often of his connection to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, his benefactor, and even manages to mention her name in nearly every conversation, as though he is trying to impress Elizabeth with his association. Lady Catherine, a wealthy, influential woman of high rank, is a domineering figure. She is described as having a haughty and overbearing attitude, especially towards her servants and the people around her. When Elizabeth meets Lady Catherine, she is immediately struck by the woman's commanding presence and arrogance. Lady Catherine is keenly interested in Elizabeth's social status and opinions, constantly questioning her and offering unsolicited advice. Lady Catherine's behavior illustrates the social divide between the Bennets and the upper class, as she seems to see herself as far superior to people like the Bennets. This visit is important because it begins to set up a larger social conflict for Elizabeth. Lady Catherine's intrusive questions and opinions will become a significant part of the story, especially as her interference will have consequences for Elizabeth's future. Lady Catherine de Bourgh continues to display her disdain for the Bennets during Elizabeth's visit. She demands that Elizabeth play the pianoforte, a talent that Elizabeth does not possess. However, Elizabeth, ever the independent thinker, does not comply with Lady Catherine's commands. She makes it clear that she will not pretend to be something she is not simply to please a person of higher social standing. Lady Catherine is shocked by Elizabeth's refusal to follow her wishes and is somewhat put off by Elizabeth's assertiveness. She believes that Elizabeth, as a young woman from a less prestigious family, should defer to her elders and betters, particularly someone of Lady Catherine's rank. However, Elizabeth's spirited response to Lady Catherine's questioning shows her inner strength and self-respect. The clash between Elizabeth and Lady Catherine further highlights the tensions between social classes and the differing views on how women should behave in society. Mr. Bingley has suddenly left Netherfield Park and gone to London. This departure comes as a surprise, especially after Jane had become so attached to him. Elizabeth's suspicions about Mr. Bingley's true feelings for Jane are confirmed when she learns that he has been influenced by his sisters and Mr. Darcy to distance himself from Jane. Mrs. Bennet is, of course, devastated by the news. She feels that Jane's chance to marry Mr. Bingley is slipping away, and she becomes frantic, trying to find ways to bring him back. Mrs. Bennet is convinced that Jane's quiet demeanor is the reason Mr. Bingley has been discouraged from pursuing her, and tries to blame her daughters for their perceived lack of enthusiasm in securing a marriage proposal. Elizabeth, however, is not as disappointed by Mr. Bingley's departure as her mother is. While she feels for Jane, she cannot help but be somewhat relieved that the situation has exposed the true nature of Mr. Bingley's character. Elizabeth sees him as someone who is easily swayed by the opinions of others, and she believes that he lacks the strength to make decisions for himself. Mr. Darcy begins to make more overt attempts to show his interest in Elizabeth, but his actions are still somewhat awkward. Elizabeth, still skeptical of his intentions, is not easily charmed by him. She notices that he seems to be paying more attention to her, but she interprets this as his prideful way of showing superiority, rather than genuine affection. During their interactions, Mr. Darcy begins to speak more directly to Elizabeth, but his behavior still feels insincere to her. He is still very conscious of his social status, and seems unsure of how to interact with her, as she does not conform to the ideal of a woman who is supposed to be impressed by his wealth and rank. Elizabeth, on the other hand, remains resolute in her refusal to be flattered by his advances, and her pride only grows in opposition to his. Elizabeth's view of Darcy is that he is too proud and too focused on his social standing to ever be a good match for her. However, Darcy is now more aware of his feelings for Elizabeth, even though he has not yet fully acknowledged them. His growing admiration for Elizabeth will lead to further tension and complications in their relationship. As Elizabeth continues to observe Mr. Darcy's actions, she begins to have conflicting feelings about him. While she is still critical of his pride and haughty demeanor, she starts to notice moments of kindness and generosity that she had previously overlooked. These small acts of kindness cause Elizabeth to reconsider her opinion of him, though she is still reluctant to admit that she might have been wrong about him. At the same time, Elizabeth is more determined than ever to maintain her independence. She refuses to let her feelings toward Darcy cloud her judgment, or make her change her principles. Her relationship with him remains complicated, with both attraction and disdain playing a role in her perceptions of him. The tension between Elizabeth and Darcy builds as they continue to interact. Darcy's growing affection for Elizabeth contrasts with her own skepticism and wariness. Mr. Darcy, after a period of reflection and inner turmoil, finally decides to propose to Elizabeth Bennet. However, his proposal is far from the romantic gesture that Elizabeth expects. Darcy begins by speaking of his admiration for her, but quickly shifts to explain that he has fought against his feelings for her because of her lower social status and her family's lack of wealth. He admits that he has been struggling with his pride and sense of superiority, but he believes his feelings for her have ultimately overcome these barriers. Darcy also expresses his belief that Elizabeth should be grateful for his offer, as he is offering her a marriage proposal despite her family's situation. Elizabeth, shocked by the arrogance and condescension in his proposal, rejects him immediately. She is upset by his assumption that she should be grateful for his attentions, given his wealth and status. She also points out that Darcy has wronged her sister Jane by interfering in her relationship with Mr. Bingley. In a passionate outburst, Elizabeth lays out the reasons for her refusal, including his role in separating Jane and Mr. Bingley and his treatment of Mr. Wickham. Darcy is stunned by her refusal and the anger in her words. He tries to defend himself, but Elizabeth remains firm in her decision, rejecting both his marriage proposal and his attempts to justify his past actions. Darcy leaves the scene, bewildered by Elizabeth's response, and she is left feeling a mixture of anger and relief. The following day, Darcy writes a letter to Elizabeth, explaining himself in detail. He acknowledges his proposal was poorly received and attempts to clarify the reasons behind his actions. In the letter, Darcy explains that his interference in Jane's relationship with Mr. Bingley was motivated by what he believed were Jane's lack of affection and her family's unrefined behavior. He also defends his treatment of Mr. Wickham, explaining that he had been duped by Wickham's deceitful character and that he had acted in good faith in not giving Wickham the money he had originally promised. Elizabeth is initially shocked and confused by the letter, but as she reads it carefully, she begins to see Darcy's side of the story. She learns that her own understanding of Darcy's actions has been clouded by her prejudice. The letter makes her realize that she had been wrong in judging him too harshly without hearing his side. She is particularly moved by Darcy's openness in explaining the true reasons for his actions, and it forces her to reconsider her view of him. While Elizabeth is still hurt by some of Darcy's behavior, she begins to recognize his sincerity and starts to see the flaws in her own judgment. Elizabeth continues to process the contents of Darcy's letter. She thinks about the events that have led to her negative opinion of Darcy, realizing that much of her judgment has been based on misunderstandings or her own biases. Elizabeth reflects on her relationship with her sister Jane, particularly how she had misjudged Jane's feelings for Mr. Bingley and how Darcy's interference had affected their relationship. She also considers Mr. Wickham's behavior, understanding now that he had deceived her with his smooth words and charm, and that Darcy's refusal to give him money had been justified. As she contemplates Darcy's letter, Elizabeth begins to see him in a more favorable light, but she still feels conflicted. She is no longer as quick to judge him harshly but is unsure about whether she can completely forgive him for his past actions. Lydia, the youngest and most reckless Bennet daughter, has run off with Wickham, and the family is thrown into turmoil. Mrs. Bennet is devastated by the news, as Lydia's actions threaten the family's reputation and social standing. Elizabeth, horrified by the news, feels both embarrassed and angry. She cannot understand why Lydia would run off with such a disreputable man. The news is particularly upsetting to the family because of Lydia's immaturity and the potential scandal that will follow. Mrs. Bennet, in a panic, demands that Mr. Bennet do something to resolve the situation. Mr. Bennet, although outwardly calm, is deeply concerned about the impact Lydia's actions will have on the family. He knows that Lydia's reputation is in serious danger, and he fears that the entire Bennet family will be tainted by her behavior. After Lydia's elopement, Mr. Darcy steps in to help the Bennet family, though Elizabeth is unaware of his involvement. Mr. Darcy uses his wealth and connections to track down Lydia and Mr. Wickham, and he arranges for the couple to be married in order to avoid a scandal. Darcy's actions are a great sacrifice for him, as he does not want anyone to know of his involvement. However, he goes to great lengths to ensure that Lydia is married and that the Bennet family's reputation is protected. When Elizabeth learns of Darcy's role in Lydia's marriage, she is astonished and deeply moved. She begins to realize the true extent of Darcy's feelings for her, and the lengths he is willing to go to for her family's well-being. Elizabeth is touched by Darcy's generosity, but she still struggles to reconcile his earlier behavior with his current actions. Darcy's true character is revealed, showing that he is not simply the arrogant and prideful man that Elizabeth once thought him to be. Instead, he is a man of integrity and compassion, willing to sacrifice his own comfort to help others. Elizabeth's perception of him continues to evolve as she realizes the depth of his kindness. The Bennet family is relieved and somewhat surprised when Lydia and Mr. Wickham are finally married, and the scandal is averted. Mrs. Bennet is overjoyed, and she is eager to celebrate Lydia's marriage, even though the circumstances surrounding it are less than ideal. She is simply glad that Lydia has been married and that the family's reputation has been salvaged. However, Elizabeth is still troubled by the way the situation was handled, particularly Darcy's involvement. She cannot help but feel grateful to him for his help, but she is also uncomfortable with the way he has intervened. Elizabeth's mixed feelings reflect her ongoing internal struggle to reconcile her admiration for Darcy with her earlier prejudice against him. Elizabeth begins to realize the extent of Darcy's feelings for her. She is no longer entirely sure of her own feelings toward him, but she begins to appreciate his kindness and generosity, even if she cannot completely forgive him for his earlier actions. Darcy continues to show kindness and generosity toward the Bennet family, but Elizabeth's feelings toward him remain conflicted. She is increasingly aware of his influence on the family's fortunes and begins to question her earlier judgment of him. Elizabeth has a conversation with her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, in which she admits that her views of Darcy have shifted. Elizabeth is beginning to see Darcy in a more favorable light, but she is still unsure whether her feelings for him are driven by gratitude or something deeper. Darcy's role in Lydia's marriage has had a profound impact on Elizabeth. She is no longer blinded by her earlier prejudice against him, and begins to see him as a complex and admirable person. However, she remains hesitant to acknowledge her growing feelings for him. Elizabeth Bennet, along with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, visits Mr. Darcy's estate, Pemberley. Elizabeth had heard about Pemberley from others, but seeing it for herself leaves a deep impression on her. The estate is beautiful and well kept, reflecting Darcy's wealth, taste, and character. Elizabeth is struck by how different Darcy's private life is from the haughty, proud persona he has shown her in the past. During the visit, Elizabeth is introduced to Darcy's housekeeper, who speaks highly of him. The housekeeper praises Darcy for his kindness and generosity, especially towards his servants. This further challenges Elizabeth's earlier assumptions about him. She begins to see that Darcy's character is more complex than she initially thought, and that the pride she once attributed to him might have been a result of misunderstandings and prejudice. While at Pemberley, Elizabeth has the unexpected experience of meeting Darcy himself. He is polite, courteous, and even seems pleased to see her. His behavior is a stark contrast to the man Elizabeth first met. He is no longer distant or aloof but is warm and attentive. This change in Darcy's demeanor surprises Elizabeth and deepens her feelings of confusion. Darcy's growing affection for Elizabeth becomes more apparent. While Elizabeth is at Pemberley, she begins to feel a shift in her own emotions toward Darcy. She starts to see him not just as a proud, arrogant man, but as someone capable of genuine kindness and affection. Their interactions become more natural, and Elizabeth begins to appreciate his intelligence and character. Darcy also speaks more openly with Elizabeth. He expresses his admiration for her and tells her that he values her opinion. Elizabeth, in turn, begins to appreciate Darcy's qualities and acknowledges that he is not the man she once thought him to be. They share a moment of mutual respect and understanding, which deepens their connection. The arrival of Mr. Wickham back into the story shakes things up again. Elizabeth learns that Mr. Wickham has returned to the area and is once again making his presence known. Wickham's earlier charm had fooled Elizabeth, but now she is more cautious, especially after learning the truth about his past actions. Wickham's return stirs up old feelings for Elizabeth, and she begins to question her earlier judgment of Darcy. She realizes that, despite her past feelings toward Darcy, he had been right to distrust Wickham all along. This realization forces Elizabeth to confront her previous biases and recognize the mistakes she made in assessing both men. It becomes clear to Elizabeth that Wickham, not Darcy, is the true villain of the story. After Mr. Wickham's return and the new insights Elizabeth gains from her visit to Pemberley, she begins to confront her feelings for Darcy. She realizes that she has been wrong in judging him too harshly, and begins to acknowledge the feelings she has for him. She recalls the many instances when Darcy showed kindness and integrity, such as his help with Lydia's marriage and his treatment of his sister, Georgiana. Elizabeth starts to see that her prejudice against Darcy was rooted in misunderstandings and misjudgments, and that she was too quick to judge him based on first impressions. As her feelings for Darcy grow stronger, she struggles with the idea of admitting them to herself. Elizabeth is not sure how Darcy feels about her, and she is still hesitant to let go of her earlier beliefs. The romantic tension between Darcy and Elizabeth reaches a climax. After much internal conflict, Darcy finally proposes to Elizabeth a second time. This proposal is different from the first, as it is no longer motivated by his social superiority, but by his love for her. Darcy's words are sincere, and he speaks from the heart, expressing his admiration for her intelligence, wit, and character. Elizabeth, now fully aware of her own feelings for him, accepts his proposal. Her feelings have changed over time, and she now realizes that she loves him as well. Darcy, in turn, is overjoyed by her acceptance and expresses his deep love for her. This proposal marks a moment of emotional growth for both characters, as they move beyond their initial pride and prejudice to find love and mutual respect. When the Bennet family learns about Elizabeth's engagement to Darcy, their reactions are mixed. Mrs. Bennet is overjoyed, as she sees the marriage as a great social accomplishment for the family. She is thrilled that Elizabeth has married so well, especially considering the family's financial situation. However, other family members, particularly Mr. Bennet, have more complex reactions. Mr. Bennet, although he is pleased with the match, expresses concern about Darcy's previous treatment of Elizabeth. He is also wary of the power and influence Darcy will have over their family. Despite his reservations, Mr. Bennet ultimately accepts the engagement, as it brings a sense of stability and happiness to Elizabeth. As Elizabeth's engagement to Darcy becomes public, the remaining details of Darcy's actions throughout the story are revealed. Elizabeth shares her newfound understanding of Darcy's role in helping her family, particularly his involvement in Lydia's marriage. She also recognizes the sacrifices Darcy made to help the Bennet family without seeking credit or recognition. Darcy is not just a man of wealth and privilege, but someone who is capable of great kindness and generosity. Elizabeth's understanding of his character deepens, and she now fully appreciates the man she has married. As Elizabeth and Darcy begin their married life, the Bennet family adjusts to their new circumstances. Elizabeth is happy in her marriage, but she is also aware of the changes that come with marrying a man of Darcy's social status. She begins to see how Darcy's wealth and position affect their relationship with others, especially in terms of family dynamics. Despite the challenges, Elizabeth remains true to her values and principles. She continues to assert her independence, even as she navigates the complexities of her new life. Darcy, too, continues to evolve as a character, learning to balance his pride with humility, and his love for Elizabeth remains a central focus of his life. Elizabeth and Darcy's marriage serves as a model for growth, understanding, and mutual respect, contrasting with the more superficial marriages of other characters in the story. Elizabeth's relationship with her family also improves, as she learns to navigate the complexities of her new role as Darcy's wife. The tension between social expectations and personal happiness is resolved, and Elizabeth and Darcy find a balance that works for them. The novel wraps up with a sense of resolution. Elizabeth and Darcy's marriage is solidified, and they live happily ever after, having learned valuable lessons about pride, prejudice, and love. The other characters, including Jane and Mr. Bingley, also find happiness, with all of the major conflicts resolved. The novel emphasizes the themes of personal growth, forgiveness, and the importance of love in overcoming social and personal obstacles. The novel ends with a sense of closure, as Elizabeth and Darcy find happiness together, having worked through their differences and prejudices.